When the Museum of Modern Art opened, they were primarily focused on the art of Europe and the art of early modernism, and it really took a picket line and a protest of contemporary New York artists to find a place within that museum and to get the museum to pay attention to the contemporary art that was being made right under their nose that's very celebrated in the history of American art today. So the museum, as it developed, kind of had these prototypes, and the prototypes had a lot to do with the way art was kind of consumed and used. The first museums, and if you look at the photographs of the first Solomon Guggenheim Museum, which was called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, which was in a brownstone, it really looked like a rich person's living room.
It was.
You had a brownstone, you had curtains, and there was no attempt to pretend that the art was anywhere other than in a domestic environment. That was kind of the model coming out of the 16th and 18th century, where some of the first private museums were curio cabinets. These places where people would take objects of a huge range that were curious and exotic and put them in rooms and charge people a fee to look at them. So the kind of combination of Mädchen and curio cabinet, the Wunderkammer in the German, was one of the first archetypes. So museums were kind of exotic places, divorced from everyday life, where you went to look at things that were not a part of your regular experience. If you look at the history of modernism, modern architecture, the modern museums built across the world, the kind of second model for museums is the museum as a laboratory. This is where the square box with white walls and hard floors were invented. And the idea of the museum being a totally neutral space was very much at the heart of modernism. The idea that art and architecture were universal experiences, that neutrality and the framing of the work in a white box that did not add or subtract anything to the work was very important to the success of places like the Museum of Modern Art and various modern museums across the world. Modernity itself is an ideological tool, and many scholarly studies have looked at the ideology of modernism from Europe to America, of how abstract expressionism was co-opted by the CIA and a tool of the Cold War. And much of the discourse about modernity, universalism, and art in these neutral, universal spaces was one that kind of neutralized the object. One of my favorite essays about museums was written by the late symbolist French poet Paul Valery, and it's called The Problem with Museums. And he says, I don't like much museums because when I walk in the door, someone walks up and takes my stick and forbids me to smoke. And what you have is a real tension between an institutional culture that basically has a mission to collect and preserve things, and a public that wants to come and have some experience with art objects and enjoy them. People sometimes are really seduced to handle art objects when they come in the museum. We have guards that suggest that they don't handle them because if they're able to handle and fondle the artwork will be damaged and perhaps not there for another generation. So when you're working with or running an institution, you're constantly looking at the mission of the institution and the role to preserve and the role to make things available and enjoyable to a larger public, and kind of the tension between those two things. The end of modernity, which is a debatable topic in time, which for me kind of happened in that art from Andy Warhol to Vito Acconci somewhere in the 70s, really created a transformation of the museum. First of all, museums increasingly became involved with contemporary culture. So in the context of the museum in the first half of the century, it would say the art of then. And increasingly from the 70s to the present, audiences and institutions are interested in the art of now. So the mix in the museum becomes, how do you relate the art of now to the traditions of the past? We think about the dilemma that the Museum of Modern Art went through, and I'm not sure that many of you think about it the way that I do because museums are my business. But I think in some ways the Museum of Modern Art would have been better off somewhere around 1980 saying, look, modernity's over. We're not going to do any more projects that are contemporary. We're going to leave that for the new museum and other museums that embrace this. And we're going to look at modernity from 1860 to 1980 and do things that are now historical and contextual. They went through a terrible period of exhibitions, the primitive in art and high and low, and just struggling to find their footing in the period that many people call the postmodern period. What does postmodern mean? After the modern. So the Museum of Modern Art today has found a footing. In many ways, they've found a much better way, not 100% foolproof, to deal with the contemporary, but they're trying to find a way to have a dialogue between the modern, which is their charter, and the contemporary. But the new museums that developed, and there was a proliferation of museums. In the 1950s, for instance, most cities in America did not have a museum. The larger urban areas of America that were wealthy with collectors had institutions. And you had people like Samuel Kress. I'm sure most of you remember or have seen the defunct buildings of the Kress dime stores. And what Samuel Kress did was start buying works from the Italian Renaissance to the 18th century through the Baroque period, like he bought his products for the dime store. He had many of the great experts of European art working for him, including Bernard Berenson. And he would go to these dealers accustomed to selling one artwork in a precious room with a piece of velvet over it that they would pull off, and he would go into their warehouse and he said, well, what if I take this, this, and this, this, and this, or what if I take all of it? And suddenly he had amassed this huge body of artwork, primarily European, from the 14th century to the 18th century. And what he decided to do was to take that bounty of collecting of the money he made from the dime stores and distribute it across America. And his deal was this: any town that had a Kress dime store, if the city would build a museum, he would donate a collection of European art from the 14th to the 18th century to populate this museum. Crazy American scheme. But what it did was to take small and medium-sized towns all across the United States. Raleigh, North Carolina, go through Kansas, all the way. And you find these museums that were founded by a Kress collection. But again, what was he doing? He was taking the great art of the past and injecting it into a context in which most of the visitors would not have any understanding of the history. So again, it's kind of taking disassociated objects, putting them on the wall for the moral edification of people. What you start to get in this period of postmodernity is moving away from the issue of the museum as the laboratory, as the neutral space, as universal space with these objects in them,